Good evening. Oh, boy, that's a long stretch. It's 7 o'clock, and our Amos Fortune Forum session is live and clear. I'm Bob Shawman. I'm one of the several committee members on the Amos Fortune Forum group, and it's my privilege to be this evening your moderator. So to all of you, welcome to our 6 of 7 sessions that we will host this summer, which is our 79th year since 1947. And as always, by a show of hands, how many of you are coming tonight for the first time? Show of hands? Okay, good, welcome, welcome. And move the mic up? How about if I do this? Okay. Okay, how's that, better? Okay. Christine, I'll lower that for you in just a moment. Now, as always, we thank you for our individual and corporate sponsors, and for those of you who have contributed in the past. Without their support and your support, it would be difficult for the Amos Fortune Forum to remain a free series of informative and thought-provoking programs. And as always, we always welcome your donations at both entrances, as 2 of our Amos Fortune Forum committee members will be there with our proverbial begging bowls. So thank you. I want to thank Ellen Widmer for hosting our session this evening. You'll notice a very interesting arrangement of flowers right below me. But not just flowers, the red suggests the rising sun, because our speaker tonight is quite expert on things Japanese. And you'll see a wave represented by flowers, and of course you'll see also a artist palette for painting. So when you have a chance, please come on up front afterwards and take a quick look. As always, following this session, all of you are invited to go over to the parish hall and enjoy some tasty munchies and refreshing cool beverages. It's also a good opportunity to meet our presenter and speak with her if you don't have a chance to ask questions during the presentation. Now, we have with us this evening a historian of Japanese art and material culture, and she has taught at several well-known institutions, including Princeton, Harvard, and Berkeley universities. Christine Guth, from 2007 until 2016, led the Asian specialism in the Royal College of Art and Victoria and Albert Museum's History of Design programs. Her wide-ranging scholarship includes art collecting and canon formation, craft practices, and more. Recently, food culture, with a particular focus on cross-cultural relations. Now, for those of you who speak fluent Japanese, I do not. So if I butcher some of the names in Japanese, they probably won't know anyway, but forgive me nonetheless. Her books include Art, Tea, and Industry, Masuda Takashi, and the Mitsui Circle, Longfellow's Tattoos, Collecting Tourism in Japan, Hokusai's Great Wave, Biography of a Global Icon, Craft Culture in Early Modern Japan, Materials, Makers, and Mastery, and Exemplary Things, Meibutsu in Pre-Modern Japan. This was published last year in 2025. Christine is a co-author with Diana Larkin on the forthcoming The Art of the Copy, Joseph Lindon Smith, and Japan. So please a warm welcome to our Amos Fortune Summer Series presenter this evening, Christine Guth.
Have I got this lined up right? Good, good. First of all, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And thank you, Ellen. I don't have my distance glasses on, so I can't tell where you are, but thank you for a lovely dinner. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. It's really a pleasure to be here in this beautiful setting and to participate in the Amos Forum Fortune Lecture Series. The focus of my talk today may be a little bit different than some of the other talks that you've had, because I'm going to talk about Joseph Lindon Smith, who you see, I hope, there, who you see standing in front of his house in the 1920s, his house at Loon Point. Correction, not Loon's Point, but Loon Point. I didn't have time to check that, to correct that. And of course, as I'm sure you all know, this is on the south shore of Dublin Lake. Now, Smith was a painter whose very long and very successful career extended from the 1880s until his death in 1950. Now, many of you may already be familiar with Smith since he was a leading member of the artist colony that developed in and around Dublin at the turn of the century and continued for a couple of decades. But if he's known beyond New Hampshire, it's for his remarkable documentation of historic monuments in Egypt and other parts of the Middle East. These are a couple of examples of his work there. They're examples of his work in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, in the Harvard Art Museums, the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures at the University of Chicago, and the Phoebe Hearst Museum of Anthropology in Berkeley. Those are just a few of the museums. So his work is all over the United States. Now, these have long fascinated, these paintings of Egypt, of monuments in Egypt, have long fascinated Egyptologists like Diana Larkin, whom I want to acknowledge here. Diana, would you stand up for a moment? Thank you. Diane and I are co-authors of a forthcoming book about Smith titled The Art of the Copy, Joseph Lindon Smith and Japan, 1901. Our book, before I say another sentence about our book, I want to say that if you want to know more about Joseph Lindon Smith's involvement in Egypt, please be sure to ask Diana afterwards, because she is the specialist on his work in Egypt, and she's incredibly knowledgeable, and I know she would love to share her knowledge with you. But I'm not going to talk about his Egyptian work at all. I wouldn't dare. I am going to talk about Smith's very little known activities in Japan. I mean, until I met a group of people who had looked at his diary, including Diana, I had no idea of this artist's activities, and I think they were extremely important. So in my talk today, what I'm going to do is talk about his engagement with Japan. But I don't want to just talk about Japan, because that represented just a tiny moment in his very long career. What I want to do instead is try to situate him within the cosmopolitan artistic and social networks of which he was a part. Networks that included Dublin, Boston, and Japan, and in fact linked all three. To do this, I'm going to draw on his diary, unpublished, still unpublished diary. Oh, yes, here's some photographs. On the left-hand side is his wife, Karina, with whom he went to Japan, Smith in the center, and his probably most important patron on the right, Denman Smith, about whom I'll have more to say a little bit later on.
Denman Ross.
Thank you. Denman Ross, yes. Catch my breath. The diary, now I will get to the diary. The diary, which is now in the Dublin Historical Society archives, is a great read. It's full of keen observations about the people he met and about his activities in Japan. But they're all conveyed in a very lively prose and with a good dose of humor. He had a very good sense of humor. But they're really valuable because they reveal how Smith, though not born into a world of inherited wealth, forged close and lasting relationships with wealthy and influential people, men and women, throughout the world, not just in the United States, but from all over. The diary also provides very valuable insights into his working methods in Japan, where he painted, and this is going to be one of the focuses of my talk today, where he painted copies of classical Buddhist sculpture and close studies of Buddhist temple interiors. Oh, now on the right is one of those paintings, one of those copies of Buddhist sculpture, and I'm going to come back to that a little bit later on. Now, only a very small number of his paintings survive from the 4-month trip that he made to Japan, compared to the several hundred paintings of non-Western historical subjects in Egypt, Iran, Turkey, and elsewhere. And I think that these paintings his Japan paintings have been undeservedly forgotten because they represented such a small part of his professional career. But as I want to show today, and I hope I'll convince you, and if I haven't convinced you, I hope you'll tell me also. But I want to convince you that these paintings were extremely important in shaping and reflecting recognition of classical Japanese sculpture as part of world art history. But let me begin a little bit earlier. Let me tell you how I became and why I became interested in Joseph Lindon Smith. Two things drew me to him. First of all, I have a long-standing interest in the men and women who mediated cross-cultural relations between the United States and Japan in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Some years ago, I wrote a book about the son of the great poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He was known, his official name was Charles, but even until the time he died, he was always known as Charlie, with the implication that he never quite grew up. Charlie went to Japan in 1871, very early, when he was 27 years old. During his almost three-year sojourn there, he formed a large collection of Japanese art, of which the family gave most of it away, but there's still a few examples in the Longfellow House National Historic Site, which you see here on the left. And on the right here, you see two examples from his collection. On the upper right is a kimono with a delightful pattern of bats against an evening sky. And down below, in one of the upstairs bedrooms, is a two-fold screen with fans floating down a river. These are just a sampling of the things that are still in Longfellow House. More unusually, while in Japan, young Longfellow had himself tattooed, full body tattooed, back and front. But I'm only showing you the back here. On his back was a giant carp. Why a giant carp? Well, in Japan, the carp was a symbol of masculine strength and endurance. And so this was a very popular motif to have tattooed, and many men did have themselves tattooed at this time. Well, as you might imagine, the Longfellow family appreciated his kimono and the paintings, but they were somewhat less thrilled by the art of the Japanese tattoo that he brought back on his body. And for that reason, Longfellow became a kind of persona non grata. He was written out of records of people who went back and forth between New England and Japan. And initially, I wondered whether Smith was the same, was represented a similar situation. I don't think so. But Charlie Longfellow was 20 years older and died roughly a decade before Joe Smith went to Japan. And the two men could not have been more different. Longfellow was basically a bachelor playboy with a very substantial inheritance from his mother, who had died when he was 16 years old. His mother was an Appleton, heiress to textile fortune. And he went to Japan basically to amuse himself. Joe Smith went there to work. But they did have one thing in common: a love of theater, and in Japan, a love of kabuki theater, and a love of costume. The photo that you see here on the left is Charlie Longfellow dressed up in a costume in the role of Sukeroku. Sukeroku was a dandy hero in a very celebrated kabuki play. And on the right-hand side, you see a Japanese actor in the same role, distinguished by the parasol that they carry. Charlie Longfellow came back not only with works of art, but with a huge collection of photographs, which are extremely valuable for understanding Japan in 1870s. So, as I said a moment ago, Charlie Longfellow and Joe Smith shared a love of theater. And when Smith was in Japan, he attended the Kabuki Theater, and in his 1901 diary, he wrote of Danjuro IX, who was the most celebrated actor at the turn of the century, and I'm quoting now from the diary. His acting seems the essence of realism and made a profound impression upon us. Hardly lifting a finger, doing little more than inclining his head while seated, the effect produced was extraordinary. That's the end of the quote. So the woodblock print on the left shows the actor Danjuro IX, who Joe Smith saw performing Sukeroku. Joe Smith didn't see him in that role, but he saw him perform. And you can tell that it's Sukeroku from the little bit of the parasol above. And on the right-hand side, which I only discovered when I was preparing this lecture, is a commemorative statue in Tokyo today, in the Asakusa, sort of the downtown theater area of Tokyo, of that same actor. Smith's love of theater continued throughout his life. And whenever he traveled, he always went to the theater. In 1910, when he went on a round-the-world trip with his patron Denman Ross, for instance, they stopped in China, and there the two men attended a Peking opera. And the painting that you see on the screen now is one in the Isabella Stewart Gardner collection of that theater, painted by Joe Smith. So it gives you some idea of the range of styles in which he painted. So my interest in people who went back and forth between Japan and the United States was one reason that I was interested in Smith. But the second reason was a little closer to home. I wrote my doctoral dissertation more years ago than I would like to remember, but my topic was Japanese religious sculpture of the 9th through the 12th century. And those were among the main subject matters that Joe Smith painted when he went to Japan. What really attracted me to him was the visual power of the ancient and the medieval Japanese sculpture that he conveyed in his work, and the impact that they had on these paintings had on Boston audiences when he returned. Unlike other American artists who went to Japan in the late 19th and early 20th century, Joe Smith didn't go to paint exotic geisha or to paint the scenery, the landscape. He went specifically to paint pictorial copies of the country's ancient and medieval sculpture. Reading about the reception of his copies in Boston helped me appreciate the important role of reproductions of all kinds, not just photographs, but replicas, facsimiles, engravings, and so forth, reproductions of all kinds in introducing Americans, and especially Bostonians, to pre-modern Japanese art. Joe Smith's role in this is very clear from an article that appeared in July of 1901, just as he was leaving Japan. It appeared in an English language newspaper, the Japan Weekly Mail. And I want to read from this article because I think it captures quite succinctly what he did. Quote, "The Boston Museum of Fine Arts, which, owing to the remarkable munificence of many of the residents of that city, promises ultimately to outstrip all other institutions of the kind in its Japanese collections. It recently took the exceptional step of sending out to Japan the eminent artist, Mr. Joseph Lindon Smith, for the purpose of getting exact reproductions of some of the remarkable specimens of sculpture in Nara and Kyoto. Mr. Smith has made a specialty of that kind of work. Pictures taken by him in Italy and Egypt created quite a sensation in America and showed that it is possible, in effect, to place treasures of ancient art in a museum without carrying the objects thither. The Boston Museum sent Mr. Smith to Japan 5 months ago to do for Nara and Kyoto what he had already done for Egypt and Italy. And Mr. Smith is now about to leave Japan, carrying with him some splendid reproductions of great works, which for centuries lay hidden in Nara and Kyoto, while the ignorant world imagined the Japanese sculpture was represented solely by netsuke and kodogu. These are little tiny shatsukis. I'll show you a couple of examples later on. The startling watercolor of a temple guardian on the right, I hope, helps you see what drew me to Smith's copies. It captures in 2 dimensions the aura of a painted wooden statue of a Buddhist guardian deity carved in the naturalistic style that was a hallmark of Japanese Buddhist sculpture in the late 12th century. The deity's eyebrows arch above his glaring eyes, his nose flares, and his mouth is open in rage. With a slight twist of his bare-chested body, he pulls back his left hand as if to punch the viewer. Smith has captured with remarkable immediacy the experience of confronting this fearsome divine force. So I was really drawn to this. When Smith painted this sculpture in the Nara temple of Kofukuji, 800 years after it was made, the image had lost much of its vibrant coloring, leaving only traces of red and blotches of white gesso on the torso. And the right arm had been clumsily repaired by suturing it at the shoulder with a large metal clamp. You can see there. Now, Smith saw this Buddhist icon through the eyes of a painter, not an art historian. But by exposing the ravages of time, he brought to this, and in fact to all of his work, both a documentary accuracy and a deep artistic sensibility to the past. At the turn of the century, the 20th century, his faithful copies of this statue and other historic monuments in Japan succeeded in becoming artworks in their own right, even as they function instrumentally to represent the achievements of a non-Western culture to the American public. I'll return to Joe Smith's Japan paintings in a few moments. But before I do, I want to speak a little bit more about the artistic community in Dublin, of which he was a notable part. But also talk a little bit about some of the ways in which he differed from them. Because while most of those people painted local subjects, his subject matter was decidedly cosmopolitan. Now, the Dublin Artists Colony included many men. Some lived there full-time, others summered there regularly, and a few only passed through briefly, drawn to the area's scenic beauty, its dynamic artistic community, and perhaps also to the fact that there were many potential patrons living around the lake in the summer. I don't have time to introduce them all, but I want to say a few words about some of the most prominent. First of all, a bit about Smith's own life in Dublin, or at least his house. Smith took up residence in Dublin following a patron's gift of a 5-acre lot on Loon Point, which is a peninsula on the south side of the lake. Over time, he built there a compound that included a house, formal gardens, and, more unusually, 2 outdoor theaters where he staged summer theatricals. And if you're interested in those, please ask Diana afterwards. She knows a great deal about those summer theatricals, both in Dublin and elsewhere. Smith's estate on Loon Point became a cultural hub that drew guests from as far away as Japan. Japanese guests included, for instance, the influential diplomat Kaneko Kentaro and the artist Rokaku Shisui. Kaneko visited when he was in New Hampshire in 1905 to help frame the peace agreement that followed the Russo-Japanese War. The Smiths had met him in 1901 through an introduction from Theodore Roosevelt. Rokaku Shisui was a Japanese lacquer artist and restorer who was employed from about 1904, 1905. I didn't put the dates down, but about that time, by the MFA. We know that Shisui visited because he inscribed his name on a bench that doubled as a kind of record of visits to the Smith's house. The Smith house no longer stands, but this painting of Dublin Lake by the young Rockwell Kent helps to imagine what it looked like in 1903, when Kent spent the summer there. Today, Kent is better known for his seascapes, since he later owned a cottage on Monhegan Island off the coast of Rockland, Maine, but he did spend a summer, as I said, in 1903 in Dublin. Why did Kent go there? Why did Kent go there? Well, he was only 21 years old, and he had an apprenticeship with Abbot Henderson Thayer, who was at the time probably the most famous of the painters of the local artistic community. He was rather eccentric, very multi-talented, and he was one of many people who immortalized Mount Monadnock in many paintings. Indeed, he painted this mountain, which you see on the left, almost as obsessively as the Japanese artist Hokusai did Mount Fuji. I was able to find at least 15 paintings of Mount Monadnock by Thayer. Hokusai painted 36 views of Mount Fuji, of which you see one, or designed, because these are woodblock prints, of which you see one on the right. On the left here, you see, for instance, Thayer's imagining the mountain or visualizing the mountain lit by a wintry sun, while Hokusai pictured his mountain, his Mount Fuji, turning an autumnal crimson. Thayer's fascination with Mount Monadnock's changing appearance under different environmental conditions may be related to another one of his passions, the natural camouflage that allowed animals to blend in with their surroundings in order to evade prey, as seen in this painting where the peacock almost disappears in the foliage. This particular painting of a peacock in the woods was painted in preparation for Thayer's 1907 publication, A Study of Concealing Coloration in the Animal Kingdom. Thayer's ideas about camouflage were hugely influential and actually put into practice during World War I. Smith's lifelong friend Frank Benson was another member of the Dublin Artists Colony, if only briefly. The two men had become friends long before Frank Benson summered in a cottage on Dublin Lake between 1889 and 93. As aspiring artists, both men had studied at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston in 1880. And 3 years later, furthered their education at the Académie Julian in Paris. It was there that Benson painted the portrait of Joe Smith that you see on the left in what was their shared garret rooms. Both Benson and Smith would make their living by painting portraits when necessary. But their artistic passions lay elsewhere. Benson loved the wilderness, where he could capture ornithological subjects, while Smith loved traveling and painting in distant places where he could capture ancient monuments. Smith was a skilled portraitist, as this portrait of Molly Coolidge on the left attests. But he didn't like painting live figures. Writing in a letter from Egypt in 1898, where he discovered the professional direction that he'd follow for the rest of his life, he wrote playfully to his mother, explaining his choice, and I'm quoting, "My sitters were never on time. They invariably wriggled and always had husbands or wives, mothers and other relatives each of whom had some criticism of the mouth, the nose, or the chin. Now, Ramses the Great is posing for me, and he's the sort of sitter I enjoy. He will always be on time, he won't wriggle, and his relatives, like himself, are in stone. So you see Joe Smith on the right, painting in Egypt, his immobile subjects. Joe Smith painted on location, spending days and even weeks before his immobile subjects. This was also true of his work in Japan. The artistic niche as a creative copyist that he carved out for himself, though unconventional, proved highly successful. One measure of this success is that in 1899, when he was in Egypt, he met Phoebe Hearst, and she bought 3 paintings from him for $2,500. Today, that is the equivalent of about $100,000. So that, if you wanted to measure success in terms of the amount of money that he could make from his work, that's indeed successful. Let me return now to Joe Smith's Japan sojourn. When Smith and his wife, Karina, went to Japan for the first time in 1901, Boston was in the throes of a Japan craze that had been ignited by the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition of 1876. There, nearly 10 million Americans, 20% of the then population, visited this exhibition. And there they had their first opportunity to see a wide array of Japanese arts and crafts. And the works that you see on the screen are among them. On the left is a 2.5-foot-high porcelain vase, one of many that was on exhibition and sold there. This one is now in the Philadelphia Museum. On the right-hand side is a photograph that was taken for Harper's Weekly, a very popular magazine at the time, and then turned into an engraving. And it shows Japanese lacquers down beneath and a fire screen that shows how Japanese artists were already adapting the works that they were showing abroad for Western interiors. Reports and actual artworks from local travelers to Japan further fueled the widespread enthusiasm for all things Japanese in the last quarter of the 19th century. In fact, many of Joe Smith's friends and acquaintances traveled to Japan, excuse me, returning with fabulous collections of art, which were on view in many cases in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. For example, Edward Sylvester Morse. He was a zoologist who taught in Japan in 1877 and 78 and returned again in 1882. When he returned from Japan, he captivated audiences. He gave the Lowell lectures in Boston. He captured Boston audiences by talking of his experiences there. And when he talked, he had a blackboard, and he would talk and he would make drawings, sketches of what he had seen. He was apparently ambidextrous and an amazing lecturer. But he also wrote a very, very popular book, which came out in 1886, Japanese Homes and Their Surroundings, which is also illustrated by him. Morse also formed a huge collection of Japanese ceramics, which he sold to the Museum of Fine Arts in 1893. So these were some of the things that Joe Smith would have seen. But there was more. William Sturgis Bigelow, son of the famous Boston physician, also trained to be a physician, but really didn't want that career. So he fled to Japan. Boston was a place where lots of people who were unhappy by the restrictions of their own society fled in the late 19th century. But Bigelow was unusual because he stayed there for much longer than most people. He lived there for 7 years, from 1882 to 89. During this period, he assembled a staggering collection. When I say staggering, I mean it. Some 75,000 outstanding pre-modern Japanese painting, decorative arts, and especially woodblock prints and books, including a lot of erotica. I was talking with someone about that earlier today, that have made the MFA the most important collection of Japanese art outside its country of origin. In fact, the Boston Museum has Japanese curators visiting constantly to study the collection. Well, let me just give you, I'm going to blow your mind, I hope, with one detail of one of the works that Bigelow purchased. This is part of a series of sliding door screens. It is a composition 35 feet in length, and it is one of the many works that Bigelow brought back. Another Japanophile who traveled as part of a globe-trotting tour with her husband was Isabella Stewart Gardner. She went in 1883 on a round-the-world trip. Now, she bought very little Japanese art at that time, but she bought Japanese art later on, including this set of sliding door screens. These are the two sides of sliding door screens, which would have been inside probably a Buddhist temple. On one side was chrysanthemums representing autumn, and on the other side, bamboo representing the spring. And interestingly enough, she didn't buy this directly. Joe Smith bought it for her. He mediated a great number of her purchases, not only of Japanese art, because people in Boston had respect for his eye, and he was a very good mediator. One last friend who was extremely influential in his life, in Joe Smith's life, and that was Denman Ross, major patron of his. But Denman Ross, interestingly enough, did not go to Japan until quite late. His interest in Japan started much before he'd actually traveled there. Ross was 10 years Joe Smith's senior, but the two men developed a very close relationship and frequently traveled together, beginning in 1886, when Joe Smith was invited by Ross on an all-expense-paid trip to see masters in classical architecture in Europe. But then the men traveled to Japan together in 1910. I wish I had time to talk about that. But basically, for that second trip in 1910, they went on a shopping spree for the Museum of Fine Arts, because Joe Smith's diary doesn't say very much about his painting, but it says a lot about how many art dealers they visited and how many works of art they bought. Ross's funding, not always his direct purchases, but his funding made possible the acquisition of many of the Buddhist sculptures that you see today in the museum's temple room, which I hope many of you are familiar with. Now, that room was inaugurated in 1909 when the museum moved from Copley Square to its present location on Huntington Avenue. And as I said, if you go there today, you will see these works, many of which say bequest of or purchased with funds from Denman Ross. Now, the last friend, and actually relative of Joe Smith's I want to talk about, is much closer to home. It was his wife Karina's uncle, Raphael Pompelli, whose name I'm sure everyone here is familiar with. Pompelli was a professor of geology at Harvard who summered in Dublin. But before that, in 1861, only a few years after Japanese ports were open to European and American trade, Pompelli was hired to survey the mineral deposits in Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost island. And upon his return, he published a book called Across America and Asia, published in 1870. And you see a magnificent copy of it with a rayskin cover that's in the Cornell Library. This is an account of his adventures, but it also included an essay on Japanese art by the painter John Lafarge, a fellow Japanophile. Pompelli's Dublin estate, which you see in an early photo, burned down. But his legacy lives on, as many of you here, I'm sure, know, in the hiking trail up Mount Monadnock, which bears his name. But it also lives on in another way, which you may not be familiar with. Pompelli was interested in Japanese art before he went to Japan, I think. And when he left that country, he received as a parting gift an album of surimono. Now, surimono is a form of woodblock print, but they're very small. They were privately issued, sort of as New Year's greeting cards. But because they were fully funded, they were printed, they're the most exquisite of all Japanese woodblock prints. And Pompelli was given 2 albums, one of which was donated by Pompelli's heirs to the museum at the Rhode Island School of Design, and the other one, which was sold and then eventually donated to the Cantor Center at Stanford Art Museum at Stanford. So there are 2 albums full of these small prints. They're, as I say, they're about that high. What Pompelli probably didn't know was that these were the very first surimono to come to this country. And so they're extremely valuable, and they've been studied rather extensively. Many of the artists are known. They were gathered by a collector into this album. And I mean, they're wonderful treasures. And I think it's hard not to imagine that Pompelli was so proud of these rare treasures that he showed them to artists in Dublin, and certainly to his niece Karina's husband, Joe Smith, before he went to Japan. So, by 1901, Joe Smith and his wife, Karina, when they left for Japan, Joe, at least, would have been familiar with many forms of Japanese art. He certainly had seen screen paintings, he'd certainly seen many Japanese prints, he'd seen ceramics, and he might have also seen textiles. But what he would not have seen was ancient and medieval Japanese Buddhist sculpture, because this was almost totally absent from the Boston collections at the time. As I mentioned a moment ago, the Temple Room only opened in 1909, so this was 8 years after Joe Smith was in Japan. The great examples of classical Buddhist sculpture, that is from the 7th through the 13th century, were little known outside of Japan in 1901, because most of them were still devotional icons in Kyoto temples, Kyoto Nara temples. And for most Americans, sculpture consisted primarily of netsuke, little things like this, made of ivory or horn, not these magnificent life-size or over life-size statues made of bronze or painted wood. Some idea of the general feeling about Japanese sculpture at the time is captured in the writings of Frank Brinkley, who was a noted authority. He criticized Americans and Europeans, and I quote, "In Europe and America, there's a general tendency to dismiss the ancient sculptures of the East, including that of Japan, as barbaric in character, without any sentiment or idealism, and with little or any regard for material beauty." How wrong they were. But to see the finest examples, such as the 8th century, I'm going to move on to the 7th century, yes, including the 7th century work that you see on the left here, one needed to travel to Horyuji. This is a statue that before the 19th century was hidden. It was not shown to the public, but now one can go to Horyuji and actually see it. And Joe Smith was fortunate enough to see it and painted a copy of it. It's a remarkable work. I'm afraid that photograph neither photograph does justice. I took this one through a frame, through glass. But this was just one of many statues that Joe studied that were still objects of devotion in Buddhist temples. But Joe also had the opportunity to see some much more closely, to study them more closely, because they had been moved to Japanese museums for conservation. By 1901, Japan had 3 national museums, and Buddhist sculpture was a major component in all of those museums. And Japanese authorities were so eager for him to paint these works that on one occasion, they even provided him with a ladder so that he could climb up and study the faces more closely. This was one of the statues that he saw close up in a museum. It's a statue made of wood. It would have originally been painted in many colors, but most of the paint has flaked off, leaving just the white underpaint. And you can see that Smith has documented it as it appeared at the time. He didn't prettify it. So he was really creating very important historical documents, as well as remarkable paintings in their own right. But one of the things that really strikes me, and that I think is very significant about his work, is that he treated this and other Buddhist subjects with respect and dignified them in a way that was uncommon at the time among European American viewers. He wasn't trying to confirm or refute preconceived beliefs about Japanese religious art, nor did he bring Christian prejudices that made it difficult for many Americans to see beyond unfamiliar conventions. Take this deity. This is an 11-headed Kannon. Kannon is the deity of compassion, and as you can see, the deity has 11 heads, which materialize the idea that this deity is all-seeing, so the deity can help people in all directions. So multi-headed deities were very common, and that did not put him off at all, the way it did many other people. Joe Smith had no trouble gaining permission to paint in temples or museums because Japanese government authorities were eager for the world to appreciate the glories of their artistic tradition. And indeed, as he was, at the very time when he was in Japan, Japanese artists in art schools were being commissioned to paint copies and to carve replicas. So what he was doing was very much of his time. This was an established practice. Now, the article that I quoted earlier, that appeared in the Japan Weekly Mail, claims that Smith was sent to Japan by the MFA. But it's likely that this was an informal commission, underwritten by Japanophile trustees like William Sturgis Bigelow, or not like, including William Sturgis Bigelow and Denman Ross. Because these men wanted copies of outstanding sculpture, both for themselves to hang on the walls of their own homes, and to fill in gaps in the museum's collection, because the museum had no first-rate Japanese sculpture yet. Since its founding in 1876, most of the MFA collection was either donated or purchased with funds from wealthy donors and trustees. And that's a pattern, by the way, that continued well into the 20th century. Annotations in the catalog of the exhibition of Smith's paintings that was held at the St. Botolph Club in Boston following Joe's return from Japan indicate that Bigelow and Ross both bought several paintings, which they later donated to MFA and to the Fogg Museum, now the Harvard Museums. The Boston Museum also directly bought a number of paintings with monies from the James Fund, and these are two of those paintings. The idea of displaying painted copies as substitutes for originals may seem strange today, but in 1901, copies in the form of plaster casts, engravings, and other replications were very common in museums throughout the United States. The American museum culture was still in its infancy, and most museums had very few original works of art. The MFA, for instance, had more plaster casts than they had original works of art. And on the left-hand side, you see an example, a view of one of those galleries. They also had many engravings of famous European paintings by Rembrandt and so forth. So Smith's copies of Japanese sculpture fit very much into this framework. And they really showed what the article in the Japan Weekly Mail that I quoted earlier pointed out, that it is possible, in effect, to place treasures of ancient art in a museum without carrying them thither. This helps explain the public response, the real enthusiastic response that Smith's exhibition at the St. Botolph Club received. The persuasive illusionism of his expertly rendered copies in color and ink earned an incredibly positive review in the Boston Globe. It was titled, very tellingly, "A New Epoch in the Recognition of Japanese Sculpture at its True Worth." Like the article in the Japan Weekly Mail, it drew attention to the sculptural subjects and documentary approach that set Smith's work apart from that of other European and American artists who painted in Japan. Then as now, his copies of Buddhist icons stood out as unique, creative tributes to the art of the Japanese sculptor. Now, Smith didn't just paint Buddhist sculpture when he was in Japan. In addition to those, here's another example of his work. In addition to sculpture, he also painted very realistic interior and interior views of temples and their ornamental gateways. Most were favorite tourist site. And so when people went home, instead of buying a cheap photograph, they would buy, or at least Joe hoped they would buy, a painting by him as a kind of souvenir. This is a gateway at Nikko, the Yomeimon Gate. And you can see how Smith, although it's very realistic, Smith has emphasized its grandeur by showing it from an angle. And he also has devoted incredible detail to the remarkable carvings of lions and dragons under the gabled roof. So this is one of the most the site was one of the most popular tourist spots for Western visitors to Japan. Before wrapping up, I want to show you two further examples of Smith's work in Japan, both temple interiors. One shows the main altar at Chionin, and the other one on the right-hand side shows the abbot's quarter at the same temple. The one on the right was purchased by Isabella Stewart Gardner, and you can still see it if you go there today. The one on the left was purchased by Phoebe Hearst and is not on view in the museum, which in fact is closed right now. I was very fortunate to be able to see it in February, but I had to go into storage. For the altar at the Chionin, Smith chose an upward diagonal view of the main altar rather than the frontal approach, which would have been the approach that the devotee would have had. And this allows for a better perspective on the coffered ceiling and the richly ornamented gilt bronze hangings around the altar. For the spacious abbot's quarter, on the other hand, Smith has taken a frontal view, emphasizing the grandeur and symmetry of the architectural space. He invites the viewer to enter this huge hall, dominated on one side by one open sliding door showing a pine tree, and the other side of the sliding door showing a Taoist sage seated on a crane in flight. But then he's opened up these screen doors so that you can see the rooms beyond, and the viewer is invited to go deeper and deeper into this temple interior. But it's totally void of humanity. There's nobody there. It's like an empty stage just waiting for the first act to begin. And to my eye, both of these views very much capture Smith's love of the theater and of theatricality. Joe Smith's paintings were very much of his time and his place. He developed a very distinctive, realistic style to reproduce in paint three-dimensional monuments that were unfamiliar to most Americans in the first decade of the 20th century. His works are compelling in their own right as a creative expression of a talented artist. But as the headline in the Boston Globe proclaimed, they also represented a turning point, a new epoch in the recognition of Japanese culture at its true worth. If they're overlooked today, it's because of their very success in paving the way for Americans wanting to go to Japan to see the originals for themselves, but also for the acquisition of great examples of Japanese Buddhist sculpture by the MFA and other museums in the United States. For this reason, I think we owe Joe Smith a great thank you. And thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions if anybody has questions. Yes?
Thank you for such a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
One question I have, it's about Louis Prang.
About?
About the photographer Louis Prang.
Yes?
And I was just wondering if you felt that the objectivity of his lithographic representations of ceramics in some way fed the visual culture that gave us an image like that with its objectivity and its close attention to materiality.
Oh, I think that's as much an observation, a very astute observation on your part as it is a question. Yeah, I think that lithographic reproduction played a huge role in certainly in the appreciation of Japanese art. Yeah. And an appreciation of materiality because it allowed for color and it captured things that are not possible in photography. So yeah, I mean, there's a wonderful book on that subject. I think I can't remember the title right now, but yes, I think you're absolutely correct. I'm just going to get my distance glasses so that I can actually see people, which I can't. Any other questions? Whoops, not my sunglasses. Here we go. No, those are my reading glasses. I know. That's what, we won't talk about age. Yes?
Does Joseph Lindon Smith have a reputation in Japan?
No, he's not known at all. And
Go back to the microphone.
Sorry. Yes, he's not known in Japan at all. And one of what Diana and I are hoping is that through his diary, people will come to appreciate his importance in Japan because he met a lot of really important artists. He exchanged paintings. I mean, it's just a wonderful diary, and it is. Yes, he visited a lot of places that other Americans might not have visited, but it's mostly the artist-to-artist connections that I think are of particular interest, and that will be of particular interest to Japanese, for sure. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
I'm wondering if there is any sort of group of artists or any kind of thread that's kind of carried through from him on into more modern styles of painting, if there's any kind of connection.
I'm not sure I heard the first part. Did he paint in other styles? Is that what you were asking me?
Did his style sort of come through into other groups of artists that are more contemporary?
No, I mean, he's very hard to categorize. I mean, there's no one quite like him, but if you have to put him in a box, he's generally labeled a late or second generation Ruskinian, because a lot of his ideas about the value of painting, of reproducing ancient buildings, sculpture, and monuments came out of Ruskin's ideas about the importance of recording, of documenting historical monuments. Yes, in the middle there.
For all the times that you went to Japan, how long did the voyage take?
Oh, that's a good question. I think, well, he crossed, you had to do the cross-continental trip first, and then I think it's about 2 weeks. Is that about right, Diana?
A little bit longer.
A little bit longer than that. But there were, I mean, by 1901, there were regular ships going back and forth between San Francisco and Yokohama. In fact, by 1900, there were actually Cook's tours going to Japan, if you can believe it. Yeah.
So two questions. During that time period, when a lot of people in Japan speaking English, so did they have a translator?
Good question, very good question. He often had a translator with him. At that time, hotels supplied translators, but also art dealers often had translators. So one of the biggest art dealer became a world art dealer, Yamanaka, which had offices in Boston. I think by that time an office in Boston, in New York, London. It was a large sort of family firm, and when the Smiths arrived, they were met by someone from the Yamanaka firm, and Yamanaka arranged all kinds of things. But there were people who spoke English. For example, Corina, Joe's wife, had gone to Bryn Mawr, and one of her classmates was Japanese, and they met her and her family when they were in Japan, and her English was very good. Second question.
Isabella Stewart Gardner was friends with a couple of painters.
Yep.
One was Melville Harder, who was also here in England, and another was Anders Zorn, who was Swedish.
Right.
Did Joseph Lindon Smith have a lot of contact?
That's a good question. I don't know. Diana, do you know?
I don't think so, though he attended a lot of events hosted by Mrs. Gardner.
I mean, he met a lot of people through Mrs. Gardner, but also he, in addition to painting, he put on these incredible pageants. And for example, for Louis Tiffany's birthday, he organized this huge pageant in Newport. So he was incredibly well connected. He was quite entrepreneurial as well as being a wonderful artist.
Oh, great. Christine, thank you very much.
My
Very
pleasure.
informative, and some excellent pictures likewise. And on behalf of the Amos Fortune Forum Committee, oh, this is so good. 1/2 gallon of New Hampshire's finest.
Woo, thank you. This is a real treat. This is special. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And thank you all for being such a wonderful audience. Let me take my...
And with that, I'll raise it so everybody can hear me. For next week, we have an excellent couple coming in. If you like singing and want to know how some of those songs began, and you're going to be participating, please join us next week at 7 o'clock for the Amos Fortune Forum. Please, you're welcome to come over next door to the Parish Hall to speak with Christine, ask additional questions. And with that, this closes the session, the Amos Fortune Forum. I'm Bob Schwalman, your host. Good evening.